All right. Hello, and welcome to today's Friday Expert Livestream. I am your host, Dan Johnson, Chief Consultant here at Next Level Nonprofits. And if you like these Friday live streams, we do these every Friday at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. You can tune in directly. And if you have an expert you'd like to suggest for one of these streams, do so in the comments below. If you drop a comment into the StreamYard chat as this live stream is going, just give a shout out, your name, and I will call you out by name. But I can't see any names back here. It'll just say Facebook user made a comment. So keep that in mind. Um, all right. So without any further adu, let's jump in. Oh, welcoming new members to the group. We had like a 25% increase in group members over the last week. So yay. Bunch of people, new people coming into the group. Welcome. If this is your first time on the live stream, really happy to have you. Okay, so at the very end of this live stream, there will be a Q&A where you'll get to ask questions directly of Alex. Drop your questions in throughout the live stream, and I will make sure that they get asked as we're talking. So today, we're talking about getting grant ready. The number one thing I hear from new nonprofit leaders is, oh, well, how do I get grants? Where do I get grants? And unlike the 50,000 Fiverr and scammer and some combination of the two online that offer to help you with grants, we've got a real expert here, Alexandra Schuppert. She has been in grant writing for about how many years now?
Give or take 8 years.
Give or take 8 years, okay. And raised almost, if it's, I'm sure it's not exactly linear, it's probably a curve, but raised almost about $8 million over those 8 years. About $1 million a year. It's a good person to have on your team. So thank you so much for joining us. Talk to me a little bit. I always like to start with, how did you get into nonprofits? What was the heart or the passion that drove you here?
Sure. I sort of, as most people do in their careers, had a bit of a roundabout route. My original goals were to be a psychologist. So I got a BA in psychology, did some entry-level work at nonprofits, entry-level psychology, direct service type work, which is very stressful, and got burned out very quickly. And it started making me question whether I really wanted to do, direct therapy or work directly with people in that capacity. And so then I went back to get a master's in psychology because I still loved the industry, the topic, to figure out what else I could do with psychology. And then got a position in a large nonprofit, child welfare nonprofit, where eventually I ended up overseeing the research and evaluation department. And that was sort of part of my love of psychology, was the research and sort of understanding how you can apply psychology for things like nonprofit programs. So that sort of is where my general interest in nonprofits developed, was at that position. So I went back for my MBA in nonprofit management. And from there, I just had a lot of positions doing overseeing direct services, so in director level positions. So overseeing programs, nonprofit operations, had evaluation capacity in a lot of those positions. And, if you work at small nonprofit, I always work for smaller nonprofits as a leader. So if you do that, you're always wearing many hats. It's just inevitable. So one of the things I did among my many hats was writing grants here and there. So it was never a major part of my position, but I started doing some grant writing in those leadership positions. And then I decided I wanted to be a nonprofit consultant. I wanted to broaden my horizons, work for different missions, different types of organizations. Overseeing direct services at small nonprofits is stressful. It's getting burnt out again. So I sort of figured that
There's almost a pattern here.
Yes. Do something for a while and then you need a change. Mm-hmm. Definitely not doing the direct services directly is the most, burnout conducive. Overseeing direct services still there. So I wanted to kind of get to the next level of my career, next level of being able to impact change on a bigger picture level, and sort of set my sights in consulting. So I ended up in a grant writing consulting position. It was actually a dual role where I was the firm's director of operations, but then I also managed a portfolio of grant writing clients. And so
because you never put yourself in a position to get burnt out, and certainly not
right.
doing two positions.
You're right. I didn't get a lot more time doing that, I guess. The juggling was hard. And what I did come to find in that, I was at that firm for 5 years, and I loved the writing, and I was good at it. I was good at not just writing grants, but the strategy behind grants, which we'll talk a lot about, I think, today. Is there's a lot of strategy that goes behind both the individual grants and developing your grant program. And so I just really love that. Also, the things you're writing about all aspects of your organization. So being able to utilize my deep understanding of all those things of nonprofits, understanding operations and program design and evaluation and outcomes, I was able to utilize all of that in my grant writing. And my clients really valued that I brought that expertise to my grant writing. And so I feel like, for now at least, I've found my niche and decided I wanted to focus on that. So I started my own consultancy, focusing on the parts of the work that I love the most. So grant writing, and then I also do evaluation and program design services.
Well, we may have to have you back for one of those. But so focusing in on grants, when a lot of nonprofit leaders, start their nonprofit, they immediately think grants, 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 grants. And often my advice to them is actually, right now, don't do grants. Now, the grants have their place in a wide panoply of fundraising. I mean, you can fundraise off pretty much anything, just about. So grants have their place, but a lot of new nonprofit leaders, we don't understand what that place is. So can you talk a little bit about when should an organization choose grants or start actually looking for grants?
Absolutely. And I always like to be very transparent about where my expertise lies and where it doesn't. Being in the sector for as long as I am, particularly in a aspect of fundraising, I know a lot about development as a whole and development strategy and how you might want to think about a development strategy. But if someone was looking for a comprehensive development strategy, I would refer them to another consultant. So I want to start by saying that. So there's all kinds of different sources of revenue. And I know, Dan, that you really start off focusing on that individual donors. And so that's, where a lot of nonprofits would start, is sort of tapping into their networks and finding individual donors. And then there's, grants can be a part of that. And even within grants, there's private grants versus government funding. Within government funding, there's grants, and then there's more reimbursement-based contracts. And then, there's earned revenue. There's all kinds of other ways that you can have a comprehensive development plan. Like everything else, diversification is a good thing. So grants should pretty much always just be a part of your larger revenue plan. I like to back into where should you place grants in that larger scheme, looking at your grant readiness. And so there are several ways that you could do that. Well, first of all, if you're a new nonprofit, you should know that developing a grants program is a long game. When you're first starting out, it's kind of like everything else when you're first starting out, whether you're starting a new business or starting anything, you kind of find yourself a little bit of a chicken and egg situation where, you'll talk to foundations and they'll say, we don't want to be your first funder. We want to see you have other funders at the table before we want to fund you. So that could be a little frustrating to hear. You say, but we need funders in order to get funders. So there's ways around that. We can talk a little bit more about that. So you just want to start with, you need to know that you're not going to be getting all the grants. You're going to have to really find those funders that will take a chance on newer programs that aren't as established yet. If you're going to want to talk to your networks, the more networked you are, the better off all of your development will be, right? Like the individual donors, you start with your networks. And same can happen for foundations, where you really can start with, who on various boards of review panels of foundations. I do grant research, we provide a list of staff and boards as part of the profiles of funders that we think you might be a good fit for. Because if you know someone on a staff or board, that can help you. It's like everything else in life. If you're connected, it helps.
So from that lens, do you it is a little bit chicken and egg, because and this is way individual donors too. Like I try to prepare, our clients or our next levelers, because I haven't come up with a better name for them. But I try to prepare our clients to go into that meeting with at least a good knowledge of the project that they want to do for their individual donors. But I know that with grantors in particular, you tend to get, or you can get, maybe I'm wrong, but I think you get a decent amount of feedback from and I'll get to a couple questions in the chat in a minute. I'm actually going to pull them up here right after this, but I want to touch on this for a second. You tend to get a decent amount of feedback from the granting organizations if you lose. Like if you don't get the grant, they can give you some level of, here's why you didn't get it, here's the issues that were with your proposal, things like that. So do you recommend that organizations just go out and start applying so they can get some of that feedback? Or what do you need to do before you actually go out and start applying?
Yes. The answer to your question is no, don't just start applying. Funder cultivation is the very first thing you want to do. So, and I should say, I'm going to focus my conversation on private foundations now. Government grants is a different thing. So if you want to ask questions about government grants, I'll sort of tackle those separately. So everything I'm saying will mostly apply to private foundations. And, there's different kind of private foundations. There's small family foundations, large family foundations, just general, large private foundations, community foundations, the foundation arms of corporate entities. So that's sort of when I talk about foundations, I'm talking about all of those kinds of things. And at most of those types of foundations, there is a position called a program officer, or sometimes the title could be a little bit different, but there's people who oversee certain grant areas, because most foundations will fund different types of things. It might fund workforce development or education and after school programming. So you want to find, obviously we want to start with finding foundations that fund the thing you do. Don't waste your time on foundations that don't. Also, foundations are very general. That can be tricky. So try to, do your research, find foundations that fund the area you work in. And the more specific you can get, the more specific they are, the better. And then the next thing you do is reach out to those program officers.
I want to dig into that in a second, but I want to bring up a question from a Facebook user because they clearly haven't clicked the link and signed into StreamYard. So what questions do you, okay, this is good. In the nonprofit Facebook groups, there are lots of people saying they can write grants, and I don't actually know the answer to this question. So this would be great. What questions do you recommend asking in order to avoid scammers or unskilled grant writers?
Yeah, so this is not a question I've thought about because I am, my consultancy is pretty new. So I didn't realize I was going to be sort of in spaces where I've seen a few, some sort of spammy grant writers. So, you want to ask for people's resume. I mean, at the end of the day, like I have a resume that shows what I do. I have references. So I can refer you to past grant writing clients. Obviously, if they're a scammy grant writer, they won't have that. So it's pretty much as simple as anything else when you're hiring someone. Check the references.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say, first of all, I don't allow anybody who does their stuff on Fiverr in this group, unless they have specifically like made an exception or something like that. If someone has Fiverr on their profile, grants are not something you want to hire somebody on Fiverr for. There are lots of things you can hire people on Fiverr for, graphic design, lots of things like that. Grants is not typically one of them. So if they have Fiverr in their profile, be wary. And also, Alex can attest, I asked her for essentially censored copies of previous grants that she'd submitted. And would you say that most grant writers worth their salt would be willing to give that to you, and it should have a decent amount of detail in there?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I had to take out some, the information about the clients. But yeah, they should be able to give you previous grants that they've written.
Okay, awesome. And there's another question that's very related to that one, which I'm going to bring up on the screen. Are there grant writers that are more focused on specific types of organizations? If so, how do you find the perfect grant writer for you, essentially?
There are. And I'm actually, as I said, I'm sort of new to being an independent consultant. So when I worked for a firm, the firm took a different philosophy. Actually, they, because they had so many grant writers, they didn't match grant writers to like I came in with a very strong like education youth development background. They didn't give me any education youth development clients, and they try to do that. They want you to diversify your grant writing and your ability to sort of understand different missions. I think they do that partly for the grant writers. I think it's a little more interesting for us when we get to write about different things. But ultimately they were client first, so they wouldn't do that if they thought that was going to be a disadvantage to the client. So I feel very comfortable writing for different missions, but I do know that some clients do focus in on certain industries. In healthcare, for example, that's the example I always use, can be very technical and very specific. So while I can write for it to a certain level for healthcare, if you're like a high level healthcare entity, you might want to find a grant writing firm or grant writer that specializes in healthcare. Education can be sort of in that similar vein.
And is that just Google? Or are there places like I don't know, Upwork or Fiverr for real grant writers?
Yeah, there's Google, or like I know of a couple of entities. So you could also find a grant writer. And that's another thing, like a grant writer should be honest about what their expertise is. I started off with my transparency around what I do and don't know around the development at large. A good grant writer, or a good consultant in general, should be very honest about their expertise and should have a network of people they can refer you to. In fact, I've already referred people to Dan. My first consult call was someone who was wanting to launch a nonprofit. And I'm like, I know something about that. It's not my area of expertise. And I found Dan and referred her. So yeah, if someone was like a hospital or something came to me, I'd probably refer them to one of the entities I know.
That's actually a really
Google
good point.
can definitely help, but there's also some nonprofit consultant entities. Like I know the Massachusetts and Colorado ones, but you can find like nonprofit consultant networks in your state and find them that way.
There's also a nonprofit consultant website. I don't know how good it is, but it's called Whole Whale. Wholewhale.com, like a giant bite, the whole thing of a whale. They've got a pretty extensive nonprofit consultant directory, which I believe includes grant writers. I know Grant Watch has one of those too, but I'm not sure that I would recommend their network. So that would be another thing. That's a good point. Like if you're talking to a consultant and you ask the consultant about 4 different things and they don't at least express a little bit of hesitation on one of those, then that's also a red flag if you're
Yeah,
trying to find somebody.
I think so.
All right, awesome. So coming back to what we're talking about, which is actually getting in touch with the program officer at the foundation. So, okay, question one: how do you actually find the foundations that you can that match your area or interested in the kind of thing that you're doing? That's number one. And number two, once you find them, do you like send off an email to the program officer being like, "Hi, I'm awesome charity that you want to support. Give me money." Or like, how does this work?
Yes, that's what you do. So first you do grant research or prospect research. There's ways you could do that yourself. You could also hire a consultant like me to do, a really deep dive for prospect research. Um, the best way to do prospect research does involve having a paid membership to, to a grant research site. So you mentioned Grant Station, that's one. The Foundation Center has one. There's a couple of sort of major players that are the go-to grant research sites.
If you can't afford it and you're building out your grant kind of department, what do you recommend? Do you recommend, instrumental or FDO, or like, what do you recommend, or what are your criteria for figuring out one's right for someone?
Yeah, I'm just learning instrumental now, actually. I've always used Foundation Center. So that for me has been the go-to, but admittedly, I haven't explored all of them yet. So I'm actually going to explore Grant Station more since I now have a membership to that one through a membership organization I joined. So yeah, and they all work a little bit differently. I think Grant Station and Foundation Centers are pretty similar. Instrumental works a little bit differently. Um,
Well,
so yeah,
let's
most of them have free trials, so you could sort of see what works best for you.
Okay, awesome. So I almost went to another question, but uh, program officer,
Yes. So
you
the
find you
first step
find the
is doing
foundation you want.
research.
Yep.
Yeah. Like finding that good fit, just having that confidence that, and then once you go to their web, once you do the research and get the prospects, do a little bit more of your own digging. So you really understand like how they describe, what they fund, really understand sort of the angles that they're interested in, read the fine print, because, they might fund after school programs, but not after school programs connected to charter school. Sometimes they have these very specific little things. So try to do your due diligence as much as possible based on their website, as much as possible. And then, sometimes every once in a while, they don't have a position like a program officer, like very small family foundations sometimes won't. And like the very large national foundations, like they just don't have the capacity for everyone and their mother to be contacting them. So they might not be as open to that pre-solicitation outreach. But for like community foundations, just the larger sort of state-based foundations, they pretty much all have program officers, and they'll list. So, they have one for education, one for workforce development. These are hypothetical topics. One for, health. So you find the program officer that's attached to the program area that you work in. And yeah, then you craft an email. Like it should be very simple. Don't go into too much detail about your program. Really, you're just saying we're an after school program and I want to know more about, your after school funding. Here's my availability. Do you have any at these times to connect? Some of them use Calendly and they have the Calendly links right on their website. So you can also just you don't even have to send them an email then. You can just literally sign up for their Calendly. A lot of them release their Calendly links, like if there's an RFP open. So you
Which
can just
is
kind of
what
go
for
in and
anybody
schedule.
who's new to nonprofits?
Yes. Some foundations use what's called requests for proposals. So like they'll have certain deadlines and they'll release their requests for proposals for specific types of organizations and work. And at that time, it's where when the program officers purposely set aside time to talk to people to tell them more, tell you more about the RFP and learn more about your organization. And then they'll provide guidance on yeah, I think you're a great fit, or maybe not so much. And again, that will be if you're new and you don't have a lot of grants, when they'll tell you, yeah, I think we would take a chance on you, or no, we typically don't fund nonprofits that don't have a record of grants yet. But and then they'll usually say something like, but we love the sound of your program, stay in touch. I do see us funding you in the future. So even if you do get that no, a lot of time it's a no, but, and you want to that's still part of the long game cultivation.
Okay. Wow, that's cool. You don't have to just guess and look at their website and hope for the best and write a 20-page grant hoping that you'll get it. You can actually talk to and that's the standard way they operate in most cases, that you can just talk to the program officer.
Either that, or some do ask you to submit what's called a LOI, a letter of intent or a letter of interest, as the first step. And they won't talk to you until you submit that letter of interest. But it's the same idea, where they don't want anyone spending time in a 20-page grant if ultimately they're not a good fit. So an LOI is another way that foundations sometimes ask to sort of just see a quick overview of your programs and what you're asking for funding for. And then they'll let you know if you're likely to advance. And then a lot of time after the LOI is accepted, then they'll speak with you.
Do you know, because I've seen these in some grants, do you know if of a good LOI template, or do you have a good LOI template that you might be willing to share?
I don't know if I have a template. More and more, they are providing templates.
Okay.
Some of the more old school foundations, it really is just a letter that you're writing. But more and more, I'm seeing they still call it a letter of intent, but basically I would call it a short application.
Okay. Like an interest form. Please give us
Yeah.
all this specific information. Okay, cool. Um, so one of our other people who are listening in, actually, so I know these guys, so I'm going to call them out a little bit. So this is a amazing organization out of Washington State, and what they do is when people are in crisis, they board their animals. They run a foster care network and they board their animals for those people so that they can get sober or go through the hospital treatment or whatever, and not worry about what's going to happen to their animal because they're not home. So they're talking about they're kind of a very different nonprofit organization. They don't fit into a lot of existing molds for either humanitarian organizations because they take care of the animal, not the person, or animal organizations because they're about helping the person, but not but taking the animal is the process. So they're like, should they look for funds from humanitarian foundations or more the animal welfare space?
That is an excellent question, and the answer is definitely both. The more angles you can attach to the work that you do, the broader, the larger the pool of potential foundations you have to use. That's great if you can sort of figure out different populations that you're helping. And then the trick is angling your grant accordingly. So if you are applying to an organization where their primary interest is helping animals, you're going to focus your grant on how you help animals. You might quickly touch upon how it also helps the people, but they care about the animals, so you want your grant to really focus on the animals. Whereas if you're applying to that more sort of humanitarian, let's say it impacts, you're helping impact homelessness, because now, if they're going to go on the streets because they don't want to leave their animal, then you may have a way in with some, housing foundations. But then you'll want to angle your grant, and you'll want to think about, grants have all the sections. You'll want to think about how you angle all of the sections of the grants for that. So, I'm thinking about the evaluation section. You want to name, focus on the outcomes of how you're helping the people. Don't use as many of your animal focused outcomes for the grant for the humanitarian foundations. But yeah, that's a really great question, because that's what I do for my clients. If I had a workforce development client, but they were developing like a mental health capacity within their organization. So we got a great grant from a mental health entity foundation, even though they're not a mental health organization. So you always can sort of angle your grants for any little aspect of things you do.
That's really cool.
And that's part of the
really
grant
cool.
strategy that I was talking about before that I love.
Right. So it's not, you may create like a general, I think I heard it called like a master grant template or something like that for a program, but then you modify that template based on the interests of the donor that you're trying to.
Yeah. And I do. Sometimes I really had to write grants almost from scratch, like that mental health one. Like, yes, there was a few sections where, I used the general organization info section. I mostly copied and pasted, but most of that was new writing and new language. So once you do start angling, you are going to have to do some, create some new language, but it's worth it.
That makes sense. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, I just went through what I would describe as Dante's seventh level of hell with getting an organization that's been around for about 3 years now, grant ready, and submitting a government grant in like a month. It was a team of 4 people that did this. The poor volunteer treasurer, I think I called him like 3 times at midnight or whatever to fix a financial statement, and getting all the data out of the founder's head and getting all of that together. We had no idea what it was going to take to be grant ready, so to speak. So, if you're an organization, you're thinking about engaging with grants, what do you actually need? What are the check boxes you should tick, so to speak, before you're actually ready to go out and start engaging some grants? Is it like,
Yeah.
I have an idea, I have my C3 status, or are there more that you need before you go and do that?
There's so much more you need. And yeah, what you just described is the prime example of what you should not do. Do not become grant ready in the process of trying to apply for a large government grant. That's like literally the meanest thing you could ever do to yourself, and probably just not possible, quite frankly. So yeah, even a lot of the smaller private foundation grants, most of them list on their website what documents you'll need, or you might need to click into their application. But the first thing I tell people to do for each grant, but especially if it's one of their first grants, is to look at the list of attachments that you'll need. And when I sign with new clients, ideally, even before I sign with them, I ask them to send me all of those things that they'll be asked for the attachments. The attachments, like the devil is in the attachments, I say. So you'll need, a lot of foundations will ask for your that IRS letter, proof that you are a 501c3. They'll ask for your list of your board list, your key staff list, your year-to-date financial statements, your year-end financial statements. If you have an audit, they'll want your audit. They understand that if you're a small organization, you might not have an audit, but read it also if like they really, really want organizations with audits, because they might just be too small for them then. What are some other common attachments? I've seen a lot asked for W-9s. Yeah, all the financials, your in-kind list. So look for, So I always, if I have a new client and they can't supply a lot of those attachments and they don't even know what they all are, I might say, you're not quite grant ready. Like, build your infrastructure and go from there. And then government grants, there's other things like they'll want to see proof of insurance and
like liability insurance in this case.
Yeah, liability insurance, letter of references or letters of support. So which means you'll need some good partnerships in place already. So so I always tell people, start with looking at that attachment list and see if you even have those. And if you don't, then you're not quite grant ready. And then there are some other there's actually grant readiness assessments out there, but there's some other things to look at, outcomes. Do you have outcomes? If you don't, there's some workarounds and we can talk about that. But, in order to have outcomes, you need to have just been operating for a certain amount of time so that you've had time to collect outcomes, and then B, just a method for collecting and tracking and measuring them.
How much time should someone be operating before they go out and ask for a grant? Is there a standard, or is there? I'm particularly interested in the outcomes piece, because I think probably 15 of the 20 hours that I spent on this grant recently was on pulling up all the numbers around outcomes. So, if I'm a new nonprofit leader and I just got my C3 status and I'm going out and, thinking about how do I raise funds and thinking about grants as part of my strategy, I've told people before, you really want to be operating for 3 years before going and getting grants. I don't know if that's a good rule of thumb, or what do you usually tell people as a general rule so they know, okay, at this point, I might actually have all my pieces together roughly.
Yeah, I think 3 years is a good rule of thumb. It depends a little bit on like how much infrastructure and how much you like if you did a logic model from the get-go and really have just been sticking to that, and you already have some outcomes and some other progress that you can show after 18 months to 2 years, you might be able to start finagling grants at that point. But like any business, a lot of time you had a slow start and you weren't able to start everything from your jump date. And so 3 years I think allows for that year where you're still testing things and where things weren't still in pilot and not being fully implemented, or you didn't really start all your tracking yet. So there's a little bit of a depends to that, but 3 years is a safe number.
All right, so we're gonna bring up a question from Sebas Mission, who actually did sign into StreamYard because they listened to me earlier. So what about those grants that don't actually need a grant writer? Just the determination letter. I'm thinking of things like, probably the Walmart Spark grant and stuff like that. What do you need in place before you get some of these really much easier to get grants?
I guess I don't really know because I'm a grant writer. So
Fair.
I got in for those. I guess again, just I always say anytime you apply for anything, just before you start spending time on gathering the application materials, really just understand what the application materials are. But if it really is just submitting a letter and a paragraph, why not? Like, that's the other thing. Like if you're not spending a lot of time, then there's no harm. The biggest harm in applying to things that you're not going to get is the time you've wasted, right? There's not a lot of harm beyond that. Now, like you don't want to be throwing too much spaghetti at the wall, and you might start getting a reputation of not understanding what you're doing. But generally the main cost of grants is time, or the main risk is that you wasted time.
I don't know. I know Walmart does the Spark Community Grant. So like big box chains would be somewhere that I would look for a really easy grant. I don't know where there's a list of these, but big box chains would be somewhere. And then the second would be sports teams. I have seen sports teams do really, really limited grant applications.
Yeah.
Like, tell us about you and how you're helping our community submit.
Yeah.
So those might be some places that you guys could go as well.
Yeah. Yeah, again, like I'm not brought in for those generally, because why would someone pay me to do something that's so easy?
Yeah.
So, and I'll even be upfront, like I usually do contract for a certain number of grants, and I'll be like, I'm not gonna use this as one of your grants. Like if you sign for 11 grants, this isn't gonna be. If you want me to do
Right.
it, I'll charge you, my hourly rate of, take me 45 minutes. But
Right.
yeah.
So, all right. One of the questions, and I want to get into some other things too. One of the questions, logic model. You used a classic nonprofit industry term, which most people outside of nonprofits have no idea what that means. Does that mean that you approach your nonprofit with logic instead of emotions, or like what is the logic model?
Actually, that might be a good way of describing it, especially for those that's getting off the ground. Is I do see people who want to start nonprofits because their emotions, their hearts are in the right place, but at the end of the day, it's like any other business where you need it sort of basically, and Dan can probably speak to this better than I can, but you want something like a business plan that goes behind it. But then even beyond that, you want to start off with a really strong logic to why you're doing what you're doing. Like why let's say you're starting what was one I just saw a logic model for? I mean, I keep on going back to workforce development because there's so much there. And I also just did a webinar yesterday on logic models for workforce developments. But if your approach is training, low income participants for a job and getting them job ready, you want to really be able to cite like what kind of training are you offering them, why, what does the research say about this approach versus another type of training, like why have you incorporated a lot around executive functioning, for example, because there's a lot of research that supports the need to develop people's executive functioning. A logic model helps you really think through like what activities are we offering, why, what does the research support? And it also then helps you articulate your outcomes, like your desired short-term outcomes, your desired long-term outcomes, and your desired impact.
And,
And
and
once you have a logic model, it just helps you articulate all of that better. So even if you don't need to show a logic model to a foundation, having that means your grants will be stronger and your outcomes will be stronger.
Can you talk a little bit about outputs versus outcomes?
Like,
Because you can find, and I encourage the person to ask that question, Google logic model and just like Google images. There's lots of examples of what a logic model looks like up there.
Mhm.
But one of the real keys about the logic model to me has always been the outputs versus outcomes.
Yeah.
Because when you're a founder and you're creating your nonprofit, often you can not really see beyond the outputs at first. You're just like, well, this is what we do, the thing we do. That's why when we work with a new nonprofit, we work on their vision statement, because your mission statement says what you do. That's cool. But your vision statement says what you're trying to create. And what you do, you can describe all day long. Like, I row a boat. Awesome. Are you rowing down the Mississippi? You're rowing to Alaska? Where are we going with this? So, can
Right.
you talk a little bit about outputs versus outcomes, and maybe why grantors would want to see outcomes, if that's true, want to see outcomes maybe more so than outputs?
Yep. Yep. I just did a training on this actually. And even after the training, there's a little like test, and it's hard. It takes a lot of practice to really understand the difference. But trying to do in a nutshell, outputs are sort of how you're track, like who you're serving, and sort of what you've accomplished, not from a goals not from a goals perspective, but just like how many you've served, how many classes you offered, for example. Going to the animal example, if you do spay and neutering, like how many spays and neuters you actually did. And again, like you will see grants where people use as an outcome. We did 500 spays and neuters. Technically, that's not an outcome. It's an output. It's still worthy. And honestly, I tend to use both outputs and outcomes in my outcome section, unless the foundation is savvy and they specifically ask you, like, name your outputs, now name your outcomes. A lot of foundations are at that point where they know the difference and they want you to know the difference. Smaller foundations, a lot of time you can kind of mix it up and say we serve 500 people and we know these people's lives changed. So outputs are really like that basic tracking. Outcomes are the change you ultimately want to see. So hypothetically, your after school program could have served 100 kids, but if you didn't help their lives at all, if their lives aren't better, even though they attended your after school program every day, how do you show that their lives are in fact better? So that's the difference, like who you serve versus how you serve or how well you serve them is basically a difference between outputs and outcomes. But like I said, it's a much more complicated, and then there's short-term versus long-term outcomes too. So
yeah, it almost could be summed up as outputs are measuring the services you deliver, more or less. Like 500 meals and 600 kids, and we gave out 1,400 Bibles and whatever. This is actually a religious example, might be a good example. We gave out 1,400 Bibles. That's your output. But if you give out 1,400 Bibles and then 1,400 Bibles sit on somebody's nightstand and nobody actually reads them, then
right.
you can't say we transformed 1,400 people's lives. Your
Right.
outcome is, what did we do to transform their life when they actually read the book, as opposed to we gave out 1,400 Bibles. Is that like a fair example?
Yeah, exactly. And even like, short-term might showing that they in fact open the Bible, they use the Bible, whereas long-term might be like, how did, reading the Bible change their lives or help their lives? But yeah,
Awesome.
exactly.
So you need basically to be grant ready. You need to have been running your program long enough to get some level of outputs and outcomes that you can show this is something we've been doing. And then you need to have
Dan just disappeared from my screen. Oh.
So,
I don't know if you disappeared for everyone or just for me.
No, I'm back. Do you see me? Okay, yes. I disappeared for everyone. Literally,
Okay.
outcomes, and the outcome of that was I touched my touchpad and closed the window.
It happens.
Oh my God. Okay. So you have enough outputs and outcomes that you can show. You've been running your program for a bit. This is something successful. Why do foundations do they only want to invest in successful programs, or primarily want to invest in successful programs? And if so, why? Why aren't they willing to take a chance on the little guy?
Yeah, for the most part, and there are exceptions. There's innovation grants where they will fund new ideas, new programs where the specific idea is untested. They still want to, even if your idea is untested in that you haven't been in operation long enough to show that your organization works. That's again where the logic model kind of comes in is, you might be able to find some foundations where if the logic behind your program is solid, they might still fund you. That said, logic is a part of it, but then there's implementation too, right? Like, if your logic is solid, but you're not implementing something with fidelity, or there's all kinds of other reasons where like logic is solid, but there's just something getting in the way of it actually having the the desired impact, of moving forward on your mission. That happens, right? And so foundations might be a little bit, wary that you might not be delivering what you say you want to be delivering. And so if you've been in operation for a while and you can show outcomes, you can show that, yes, you train people for job readiness and now they're employed, for example, that's an outcome. They want to see that. They don't want, they might be wary to say, okay, you're training people, but how do we know they'll be successful in a job if they haven't been employed yet? So it's really as simple as they want to know it's a social investment, right? They want to know that they're investing in the change that they want to see. They're not really investing in programs or organizations. They're investing in change. And they know that organizations that are doing it well or how that change is going to happen.
What about, this is another question we've got from one of the audience. What about faith-based donors? Are they likely to find, faith-based donors in foundations? Are there foundations that focus on that? Or are these gonna, where do you find people if you have like a faith-based organization?
Yeah, I've always not worked in faith-based arenas myself. So again, my expertise might be a little limited. Obviously, a lot of foundations will not fund faith-based work. And they'll say, it says that right up front. They won't, not to say if you're a faith-based organization, you discriminate, but they tend to list these things together. They won't fund organizations that do this, that, and the other thing. And faith-based
or politics or something like
or,
that.
Yeah. Politics, that's a big one. They won't, they might fund lobbying. You want to look at the fine print, they might not, but yeah, nothing that's, affiliated with a party or something. Those search engines that I talked about, that's one of the things you can enter. So in your grant research, you should be able to enter that as one of the filters and find them that way.
Okay. Awesome. So what about, so we talked about becoming grant ready. We talked about, how to find these foundations. We talked about how to connect with them. And I can't sell enough to figure out what my next question is. So we'll go on to a different question, which was how boring/creative should you be when writing grants? I know the government grant we wrote recently was boring and limited. So there was lots of limitations on the amount of characters you could use in certain places and things like that. But I've also seen things like pictures in a grant application before of what we've been doing or things like that. So in some places they'll tell you this is exactly what we want and how we want it. But if they don't, how do you approach that?
Yeah, government grants are always going to be the most boring, the most dry, and they'll be asking about regulatory things and things like that, which is just like so hard as a grant writer to even write about it. It's so boring. For your average foundation grant, you want to be pretty boring still. And not, boring is the wrong word, but you want to not go too much into flowery language or stories. And I'll put a caveat to that in a minute. You really want to try to stick to the facts. And yes, and make the facts interesting and compelling. That's why boring is maybe not the right word, but it needs to be fact-based. And foundation grants always have character limits too, pretty restrictive ones. So you generally don't have room to go into sort of like offshoots of stories and things, because otherwise you're just not going to be able to describe your whole program or describe your whole organization. Like, you need to use the room you have to just get right down to the facts of things. The exceptions are, some grants say point blank they want a participant story. So that's where you get to really do more storytelling. Sometimes in like the organizational background section, like that could be a little bit more story. Like you want to sort of tell the story of why your organization got off the ground. So, if you have a nice founding story, that's appropriate to write about in that org background section. But yeah, the rest of it needs to pretty much be pretty dry. And then they'll also say, some of them will say point blank they have, if you want to attach supplemental information, a story, a picture, and you have those things, and then you can do that there.
And anything in particular you want to put in the supplemental information section when maybe it's not asked about in the grant or something like that really helps? Because the supplement at most grants, what I've seen, they're very specific about what they want in each section. Then they throw this last section at you that's like, and by the way, if you thought we missed anything, throw it in here. So is there something in particular you really see work well when you throw it in that supplemental information category?
Honestly, I tend to use the supplemental information, because chances are there's something really important that I just didn't have room to talk about in one of the other sections, like the part of, description of the program. And I just couldn't describe this we also do this in the program. I personally tend to use the additional information to be like, also, we do this really cool sub part of our program that I couldn't fit into this part. But if it's an attachment, if a lot of time they'll have sort of a vague like attached stories or pictures here. A lot of time I'll do both. I'll kind of have a picture with a little blurb about what the picture is showing. Like this participant, maybe it's just like a picture of a mom and her kids, right? Like that's the picture doesn't show much, but you say this is a picture of our participant who, because of our services, now has a job. She was able to buy a car. She recently took her kids on their first trip out to the mountains. Like, little
So that's where you can put like
picture.
those client stories and things like that is in that supplemental section.
Yeah, they say like attach pictures or stories here. I like to create a little document that has a picture with the story.
That's really awesome. Great. Do you guys have any other questions for Alex? If you have any other questions, go ahead and pop them in there. So tell us a little bit about the work that you do for organizations and what they can do to contact you, things like that.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, I left the firm to start my consultancy called Lighthouse Nonprofit Consulting. My firm was in Colorado, and I moved back to Massachusetts, and so that's kind of why I was sort of inspired by the Lighthouse, is because they're re-embracing that New England vibe.
I was gonna say there is more lighthouses in Massachusetts than Colorado. So
I don't remember seeing too many lighthouses in Colorado. Yeah. lots where I live now. Yeah, and so today we were talking about grants, but we ended up talking a lot about evaluation too. And then we also talked about program design and logic models. And I bring all those things together. So, grant writing is my bread and butter. It's why most people I know are going to find me. But when I worked for the firm, I worked with so many clients who like their outcomes and evaluation section just weren't where it needed to be, or they were developing a new program. Like we were applying for a grant for a program that hadn't started yet. And I was like, oh, we're kind of missing some details. Like I'm not able, like, I don't have a good description of like why we're using this approach. And so I'd help them think through that approach. And, I was on salary. So I do all these things, even though it's not strictly grant writing, just because I happen to have the expertise. And I love that though. And I love that I was able to do that to some extent. I also wasn't able to do it to the extent that I enjoyed because my primary job was grant writer at the time. So my consultancy really brings that all together where, yes, I can, if you have great outcomes already, great program design already, I will write your grant. If I see that the outcomes can be stronger, the program design can be stronger, I can also help you with that. So I kind of like work at the intersection of all of those things. And so by creating stronger evaluation, that has so many benefits for your program, but it will also definitely benefit your grants and your ability to raise funds.
Awesome. And I've dropped her link to Lighthouse Nonprofit Consulting in the chat. First of all, big shout out to Cebus for doing a bit of promotion and getting people into the group. We're just getting this live stream started. This is a record number of people on the live stream. So super glad to have you guys. We do these live streams every Friday. Every Friday at 12 p.m. we do an expert live stream. Invite people to the Launchpad. I think we've had like a 40% increase in membership over the past 2 weeks, which is great. Keep inviting people to the Launchpad if you like this. Also, remember, on Wednesdays, I do an Ask Me Anything. Any questions that come up about your nonprofit, you throw them in the chat. As a disclaimer, I'm not an expert on literally everything, but I do answer all your questions in an AMA, and that is also at noon Eastern time in the Launchpad. So mark your calendars, noon Eastern time on Wednesday for the AMA and noon Eastern time on Friday for an expert. Alex, it's been so great to have you here. If you have any additional links, you can give them to me. I'll make sure to put them in the group. Or actually, you're part of the group, so you can post in the group. And if you guys have additional grant writing questions and you pop them in the group, Alex is a group expert and she'll be tagged as such, so she'll be able to see those. Thank you so much for coming on to the expert live stream today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
All right, guys, you all have a great rest of your week and weekend, and I will see you all next week.